Tribal compacts were the focus of the end of this year's special session. Even as Governor Stitt tried to offer new compacts for tobacco and license tags, he filed a lawsuit to block the legislature's compact extension. Moderator Reese Wetzel and his guests join us now to discuss the dispute and what's next for compacting between the governor and the tribes.
Thank you, Taylor. I want to start this discussion by saying we invited a representative from the governor's office and an attorney from a tribal nation. Unfortunately, after initially agreeing to appear, scheduling conflicts arose. With that being said, I would like to introduce our guest today to help us discuss tribal compacts. We have Scott Meacham, director at Crow and Dunlevy, and joining us via Zoom, we have Chairman Matthew Morgan with the Oklahoma Indian Gaming Association. Thank you both for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
All right, Chairman Morgan, I want to start with you. Tell us about the Oklahoma Indian Gaming Association and what the organization does.
Sure. So the Oklahoma Indian Gaming Association is a 501c6 organization, very similar to what most Chamber of Commerces are organized under. Our job is to advocate for and educate both our members and members of the public on what the tribal governmental gaming industry does for Oklahoma and for its citizens.
All right. And Scott, we're going to turn to you here. You actually worked with Governor Brad Henry and you dealt with tribal compacts. What were some issues that you guys faced and some of those negotiations over gaming that you dealt with?
So I was kind of the governor's point person on both gaming and tribal tobacco compacts. And so those were my two areas. On gaming, it's kind of interesting because today everybody's kind of forgotten that really it was the horse racing industry that drove that at the state level, because we're about to lose Remington Park and we're about to lose the source of horses for the horse racing industry. That plus you had tribes that were out there playing these kind of electronic class 2 bingo games that looked to be like slot machines, and they were getting pressure from the federal government and they were coming to the state wanting compacts. So that led to this effort where we had the horsemen, the tribes, and the state coming up with an agreement that for Governor Henry would produce money for education.
All right. And Chairman Morgan, you were in the gallery of the legislature during the veto overrides of the tobacco and license tag compacts. What were your thoughts when you watched that?
Well, I always enjoy going to the legislature and watching them do their work. I know a little of a policy wonk in that regards, but I think the things that stuck out at me was one, we're in the middle of a summer special session and all these legislators had to come back over this issue, which was, in my mind probably wasn't necessary, but, was required. And then two, I think just in the discussions with legislators, just the lack of institutional knowledge, as Scott said, so many people forget of how we got here and what we were going through and why those agreements were so, important for us at that time and how hard a lot of people worked to get those in place. And, that's just not in the building anymore.
And you said important at that time. What would you say the reason that they are still so important today?
I think that those agreements create a foundation document between two sovereign governments on subjects that either both governments can benefit from, or if they're disagreeing over each one's rights and responsibilities. And it allows both parties to come to the table and work together to create a win-win situation for everyone, instead of spending, this time and money fighting it out in litigation in courts, that the parties themselves can sit at the table, pound out an agreement. Sometimes that's more difficult than others, but find a middle ground, because I think all of our citizens, that's what they want. And it shows that, how we can move together forward into, as separate governments, but unified in a position of making Oklahoma better.
All right. And Scott, before this, we were kind of talking about the history of the tobacco compacts and help Oklahomans understand how far back this goes. It's not just a recent issue.
No, it's not. In fact, it really started in the Walters administration. The state sued Big Tobacco and got a big settlement, which we call the Master Settlement Agreement. We have $1.8 billion at TSET right now that's been funded by that agreement over the years. Probably got around $70 million a year now under that agreement. It required us to take action to get rid of contraband cigarettes, would be cigarettes that didn't comply with state laws requirements of manufacturers. That required the state to enter into compacts with the tribes. The first compacts provided the tribes would pay 25% of the state's 23-cent tax. And the Keating administration entered into the bulk of those. A few of those were done in the Walters administration. Keating administration had sent notices they wanted they were terminating those compacts, were not going to renew them because there was a desire to raise the tobacco tax, and that would make the price, if you're only paying 25%, that makes the tribe's price advantage went up. We entered into compacts that said, okay, we'll freeze that price advantage at 23 cents, but you're going to pay 100% of what it ended up being, an 80-cent per pack increase. Well, and then we created some border exceptions, probably did some things that in hindsight created more confusion. We had all these different stamps out there. Well, the Fallon administration came in with, I think, a more elegant solution and basically adopted a unified tax rate of $1.03 a pack with the tax split between the tribal nations and the state. Well, those are the compacts now that are up for renewal, and as I understand, what the governor's wanting to do is limit within tribal jurisdiction the ability of tribes to have new smoke shops, which is kind of interesting because if Chairman talked about sovereign nations, that'd be like us going to Kansas and saying you can't have any more smoke shops in Kansas, or us going to OnCue and saying you can't build any more OnCues in the state. So, I think originally it was about parity. We got to parity. Now we're kind of, in my mind, sort of invading the province of sovereignty and tribal governments.
And is this because of the McGirt decision?
They link it to McGirt, but I don't really get that. McGirt, it has its own historical underpinnings, but if you look at it, it is a very narrow opinion under the Federal Major Crimes Act, where the court, in a split decision, decided that not state courts, but federal courts and tribal courts could prosecute crimes by tribal citizens on tribal land. In fact, McGirt ended up getting life sentence out of federal court, and so serving a life sentence now because of that. So it was really just about crimes under the Major Crimes Act and just about who could prosecute those crimes, the state or federal courts or tribal governments. So, I just don't understand the concern and the relitigation of McGirt. I think we ought to be focusing on how do we implement the Supreme Court's decision in McGirt.
Well, Chairman Morgan, that brings up a good point. What do you see when you hear the McGirt? Is that kind of the same thoughts that Scott's having?
I do have similar thoughts to Scott on that because, McGirt was decided 3 years ago. We've not seen this proliferation of tobacco C-stores or smoke shops, that Governor Stitt has said there's a reasoning why he needs to do this in the tobacco sense. What you've seen is, I think, both the tribes that McGirt has affected, and again, we need to be clear, there's only been 8 tribes whose reservations have been reestablished under the court system, and we have 38 tribes in the state, so it's not affected all of them the same. The ones it has affected, I think, are working really hard every day, both within their own tribal governments and with their local partners to make sure that, they're filling gaps because, there are some challenges that go along with that. We've operated one way for 100 years, and now we're having to readjust and see where there's opportunities that we can help each other. But what we're continuing to find is that, this colors every conversation out of the governor's office in a way, to be quite frank, has just not been helpful or productive. When McGirt was originally decided, the governor went back with his legal team 43 times asking the Supreme Court to overturn the decision. And we're still seeing, today him being very obstructive in ways that are not helpful when we're talking about, governmental services, law enforcement, public safety. And I just don't see how we all look at McGirt and not see that as an opportunity to continue to get better. Oklahoma is a very rural state. In a lot of ways, we're a very poor state. Tribes bring in these added economic benefits, this added relationship with the federal government and federal dollars that could really go a long way, especially in rural Oklahoma. And we're just not taking advantage of that in the way that we should, in my opinion. because we're so caught up on what this McGirt decision may or may not mean, instead of accepting the decision, as Scott pointed out, and work on let's figure out how to implement it now.
All right. Well, Scott, we talk about disagreements. Were there any disagreements between Governor Henry and the tribes, and how were they resolved?
Yeah, we absolutely had disagreements. I mean, I remember appearing before all the tribes and telling them, like the Keating administration, we weren't going to renew their existing tobacco compacts. That was not a pleasant meeting. But we had, you know, we would have disputes in the implementation, or disputes, I would say disagreements with in the implementation of the model compacts. And under the compacts, you meet, you have a meet and confer and try to work it out. We always got them worked out there. Now, we did have a dispute with the Cherokees once. We created these border exception rates, and the Cherokees were importing those into their shops outside the border. We argued that was wrong. They argued they could do it. Well, under the compacts, there's an arbitration provision. So we went to the AG, asked the AG to bring an arbitration action. We won. Cherokees abided by it, and we all moved down the road. It didn't taint the whole relationship. We just agreed to use the dispute mechanism in the compact.
How hard was it to maintain a good working relationship with the tribes at that time?
Well, you know, I think our attitude towards the tribes was, number one, that we wanted to work collaboratively with them. Honestly, Brad Henry and I are both from rural Oklahoma, so we saw the tribes as major partners for economic development in rural Oklahoma. Now, there were obviously state interests that we were concerned about, but we dealt with them as a sovereign government. And honestly, probably at first, I actually went too far down that path. I remember we were in a dispute with the Creeks. We never could get a tobacco compact worked out with them. And I went to meet with their tribal council. And after this sort of contentious meeting, this one tribal councilman looked at me and said, "Mr. Meacham, I hope you just understand that, yes, I'm a tribal councilman and represent my tribe, but I'm also an Oklahoman and care deeply about this state." And you know, that was a kind of a realization for me, and a little bit of a wake-up call of, yeah, we need to figure out how to work together for the mutual benefit of everybody.
All right. Well, Chairman Morgan, we talk about working together. Let's look in the future here. If the legislature decides to legalize sports betting, would that bring the governor and the tribes back to the negotiating table to discuss gaming compacts?
I mean, ideally, under the model compact, they allow for what's called a gaming supplement. We did this with the ball and dice legislation. So again, ideally, what we'd like to see is have discussions with both the legislature and the executive, where we could come to an agreement on what that would look like, and before legislation would be passed. But ultimately, the legislature, in my mind, is in the driver's seat on whether they want to offer something. Of course, the governor always has the veto power, but it's the legislature, in my mind, that has that authority to decide if and when we take up the subject on our side of the table. I think we just have to be well prepared to have that conversation on what that looks like. The economics of sports betting are unlike other casino games. And so, I think tribes would be very sensitive to what that looks like from an economic point of view, given that they'd be taking on all the risk. And then, what does that fee sharing arrangement look like for the state in order to get something done? I personally believe there's a path forward there, and it's not a difficult road if that's really the only subject we're talking about, because I talk to everyday citizens in this state, and they all ask the same question: when are we getting sports betting? And that's really not my decision, but I mean, I hope at some point in the near future we do take up that conversation. If not, for the easiest reason to say, you know what, let's get on a better path with the legislature and the executive and tribes sitting down at the table and having respectful and productive discussions.
Yeah. And Chairman Morgan, I'll stay with you here. Are there areas where the state and the tribes should consider new compacts, and what would that be?
In my mind, as I said before, compacting is a way for two separate sovereign governments to share responsibilities on a subject that they either really believe they can benefit from. There's disagreement over where those lines are, or maybe both of those are occurring. And so I always think, if there's a subject that we are not agreeing on with the state, that is something we should always look to. as things are implemented, as tribal governments grow and become more sophisticated, as the state government grows and becomes more sophisticated, and there are new economic development activities that come into our purview, as there are more governmental programs and services that are being offered, I think we should look at ways to partner, and I think those subjects will continue to present itself. It's just a matter of whether we're able to sit at the table and move forward in a productive way.
Scott?
Yeah, I can add some specifics where I think. So first off, in the wake of McGirt, I said, the federal system is basically going, so the FBI took on all this investigative obligations. And interesting, so at the local levels, we have a lot of cross-deputization and collaboration agreements with the tribes, with like local cities. We don't have that at the state. So there needs to be, so if the OSBI is investigating something, it turns out it's a tribal member on tribal land, we need to be able to work collaboratively with the federal government and the tribes on those investigations. Also, tribes are getting more into retail and owning grocery stores, for example, sales tax, things like that. We need to have specific compacts on those things.
All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Scott Meacham, Director at Crow and Dunleavy, and Chairman Matthew Morgan with the Oklahoma Indian Gaming Association. Thank you all for joining us.